Hi everyone, it's Joe from Homegrown Musician and welcome back to another video. So around about a month ago, I made a video taking a look at the BBC Discover sample packs by Spitfire Audio, so just your typical first look sort of video, and I'll link to that down in the description. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at another Spitfire product, the LABS sample packs. So personally, I've heard really good things about the LABS sample pack anyway, and what makes it even better is they're completely free. So I thought I'd download them, take a look and see what I could make with them. So installing Labs is actually really easy. The first thing you'll need to do is make an account with Spitfire Audio and download their app. Then open the app and it should prompt you to select a drive location for where your samples are going to be stored. This can either be a main drive on your computer or an external hard drive like me. Then go into the Labs section of the app and download whichever samples you feel like. So now you should be able to open the Spitfire Labs plugin in any major DAW. Simple as that. So the user interface for this plugin is actually really nice and clean. There's a menu where you can select the instrument you want to use and one singular control knob which changes all of the parameters for that instrument. Now besides that, there's not actually a lot of parameters to change. I found most instruments only have maybe a bit of reverb or a very basic envelope. Every so often, some of the patches come with this thing called variation feature, which basically just changes the main kind of effect on that instrument. So be that a bit of distortion or LFO, etc, etc. However, you can always use external audio effects to make stuff sound way crazier than it ever did before, so it's not really that much of a deal breaker. So now that everything's set up, onto the writing process. So when I started writing this, I knew that I really wanted to test Spitfire Labs, so I made sure that I used absolutely no other instruments, either recorded or virtual, and I can categorically say that I only use Spitfire Labs. So because I'd never used Labs before, I thought the best thing to do would just be to cycle through a few of the patches, maybe check them out, and just play about on my MIDI keyboard to see what I kind of gravitated towards. So like I've said a million times on this channel before, I have absolutely no keyboard skills and cannot hold a melody, so I started moving towards chords instead. I found this really nice voicing of a D9 that I liked, and I started to fall into this cool 7/8 groove. Now I wasn't particularly happy with how I was playing it, so what I did was I set up a noise gate in Ableton itself and got a trigger track and sidechained it to that trigger track. Now I'll do a more detailed tutorial on this in the future, but effectively, just like with sidechain compression, you use the trigger track to turn the noise gate on and off, and when you put that noise gate on something like, for example, my piano, it plays a rhythm, so it's a pretty cool effect. So I went back to those ambient tracks from earlier and played the D9 chord on them, and I got this really cool, nice big ambient soundscape, put the noise gate on them as well so they had a little bit of rhythm to them, and all of a sudden I could feel a track forming. However, it felt a bit more orchestral than like traditionally pop stuff, which is kind of what I wanted to go for. So I decided to use the drums that are built into Labs and drop a drum beat over the top. So it was at this point I went back to a patch that I'd previously kind of thrown out, the Chirango. Now when I first found it, I liked the patch, but I didn't think it fit the style I was going for. It was quite folky and I wanted more electronic. However, with the 7/8 groove, I tried an Eastern European sounding melody and I think it worked really well. So for the B section, I decided to actually have no melody at all and just to kind of sit on some nice floating chords just to change the pace a little bit. So because the B section was chordal, I thought that the strings that I already had in place would work quite well for that. So instead of finding a new patch or writing something completely new, I just bought the string part from the A section, adapted it a little bit so it worked with the new chords, and then brought it up in the mix so they got a bit more of the limelight. So to finish the piece off, I decided to recap the A section in its entirety and add these kind of high voiced chords on like a Fender Rhodes style sound. I also decided to add them to the first A section because I liked them so much. And that is pretty much it. So now that I've finished the composition, I decided to move on to the mix phase. Now obviously the whole point of the track was to show off the Spitfire LABS sounds, so I didn't want to do a really destructive mix and change those sounds too much. So mostly I was just leveling things out, using a bit of subtle EQ and compression just to make sure everything could be heard. However, I did also do some slightly more interesting things and I'll talk about those now. So the first technique I want to talk about is parallel compression, which I used on the drums. Now I really like parallel compression because as a form of compression, it gives you a bit more dynamic control. However, it's still really good for retaining the original punch and clarity of a sound, which is why it works so well on drums. So to do parallel compression, the first step is to duplicate the track you want to use it on. So in my case, the drum bus. Now apply a compressor to that duplicated track. Now you can actually be pretty aggressive with your compressor settings here because you're then going to blend the duplicate track in with the original track. So obviously the duplicate's been pretty heavily compressed and is nice and tight and very dynamically squashed, whereas the old track retains all of its original punch and transients, which like I said is why it works so well on things like drums, because it gives you the weight of a compressor but the punch of a really dry signal. So the next technique I want to talk about is the use of parallel processing on my bass sound. So like I said earlier, I wasn't particularly struck on the bass options I had within Labs, but I managed to find a patch that I quite liked and I decided to run with it. So I could feel all of the weight in this bass, but none of the articulation. I couldn't actually hear the notes that it was playing in a full mix. Now I thought to myself, to increase articulation, I could probably use a little bit of saturation or distortion and some EQ to help bring the mid-range out. However, I didn't really feel like this was cutting the mustard, so instead I decided to use parallel processing. So just like with parallel compression, the first step of parallel processing is to duplicate the track you want to use. So on the duplicate, I then cut all of the low end and most of the high end so that I was only really dealing with the mid-range frequencies. So now when I applied my saturation, I found it was much more effective. I wasn't muddying up any of the low frequencies or bringing out any of the really high harsh frequencies. I was focusing exclusively on the mid-range and it made the bass much more present. Not only that, because I duplicated the track, I'd also effectively raised the volume of those mid-range frequencies anyway, which kind of acted like an EQ. So I'm kind of going to go against what I said earlier because I did actually use one or two creative effects, particularly a delay which I had on a bus and was sending to various tracks. So I wasn't actually using this effect in a traditional sense, it had a very specific compositional purpose. What I did was I automated the delay time to change at very specific points, because what happens is any tracks that are currently running through the delay, when the delay time changes, have what I dub a time warp effect applied to them. And all I can say is it adds this really weird kind of warbly tape sound to the tracks, and it really fit the style of the piece. So it's a pretty old school effect and it originates from the tape machines of the 1950s, but I actually think it's a really cool sound. So that actually brings us to the end of today's video. If you haven't already, I massively recommend checking out Spitfire's stuff. It sounds amazing, but especially their labs because, well, they're free. Hopefully you've enjoyed watching me mess about on today's video, maybe you've even learned something new as well. If you have, please remember to like, share and subscribe as it massively helps the channel.